Paola de Calle is visiting us from San Francisco and is here to talk about her exhibition, Everything is Ruins in This House. So, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about, and I guess I wanted to start with the title. So the title itself comes from a poem by this poet called María Mercedes Carranza. She's Colombian, which is where my family is from. And the poem is called La Patria, or the homeland. And it uses the home as a sort of metaphor for violence and colonization, death. But she does this really beautiful dance between sort of telling stories about violence and death, but in a very just what poets do. She did it in a really poetic way, in a really beautiful way that sort of makes you think about the home in a different way. And a lot of my work is about memory and nostalgia and home, and I bring in a lot of personal objects from my dad's collection of stuff into the work. So it fit very well. And the title of the exhibition, this is technically like a part two. I had my first solo show in San Francisco, and it was called In This House We Are All Buried Alive. So that was also a line from the poem. And then Everything is Ruins in This House sort of comes as a part two. And when I was thinking about the show, I was really playing with this idea of desentierro, or unearthing, like what happens when you're digging in the ground, digging through your history, like what are the things that come up and what are the things that you find? And also thinking about the future, like what are people going to find about us, and like what are we leaving behind, and the sort of objects and remnants. And I was doing a lot of research on archaeology, just like early stuff, conceptualizing like what does an archaeological site look like? What are the things that sort of survive through time? What are the things that don't survive through time? So in a lot of my work, I work with a lot of different materials. I work with coffee as a medium to paint with. I work with iron as a medium to like screen print with. I work with ceramics, textiles, obviously, found objects. And they're all sort of in conversation with one another. For this show, I'm really thinking about the ways that we communicate across borders, and sort of the ways that stories get passed down through family members, passed down through time. So if you look, we can like talk about that series behind you. So that's my calling card series. And that series references the calling card. Some of you might have used it if you had family out of the States and use the calling card to call them. But I'm using the calling card as a sort of vessel to talk about storytelling and the things that sort of we share through our voices and through these calling cards themselves. I was doing this really intense form of therapy called IFS, internal family systems, that some might consider like very woo-woo or like spiritual maybe, where you talk a lot to your inner child and you revisit your past memories and sort of have the ability to intercept and like rewrite them and revise them, which is sort of also an interesting way to consider memory, like what is a true memory, and does that actually exist? And in one of my sessions, I was thinking about something that happened to me and my sisters, and I imagined a calling card being like a magic carpet, or like a vessel that we were riding to the mountains of Colombia. And that was sort of a way that I rewrote or like intercepted. So those calling cards really emerged from that. And the images that are on those calling cards come from WhatsApp messages and exchanges with my family. So like a lot of the memes come from those conversations themselves. And home videos that my family we used to like send home videos back and forth to each other in Colombia and the United States to like share birthdays and share like first communions and just like what we were doing. So I digitized those and then fired them onto the ceramics. And there's also Google Map searches in a lot of the works, especially this one, where I'm sort of retracing my steps between my two grandparents' homes, and like getting lost and sort of trying to figure out like where that memory went. Why can't I remember to take a left when it's really a right? Or so a lot of the work is really a sort of the question about like what is truth, who gets to like remain in an archive, who gets to be put in an archive, thinking about how those things are also about power, and not everybody's history gets to be told, and sort of trying to bring my family's personal story into the narratives. Yeah, I feel like it might be helpful for folks to ask questions, or I can like, talk more about my specific use of materials if that's helpful. Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, I can talk about the materials. So I use coffee a lot in my work. So this portrait is made of coffee. The portrait behind you is also made of coffee. And then the stuff that's screen printed is also coffee and sometimes iron, as well as the print behind you. And I think for me, coffee is my history is in printmaking. I like started as a printmaker and then slowly worked my way out, and now I'm like working my way back and figuring out how to sort of bring all the elements of my practice together. But coffee is a export of Colombia, so that in itself is very political. But when I go to Colombia and I visit my parents, I see that they're using instant coffee. And for me, it made me question, like, why is it that we're in this country that has some of the best coffee in the world and we're using instant coffee? And it's because the people in Colombia don't have access to like a crop that grows on their land. It's too expensive. So when I first started painting with coffee, I was using like really nice beans. And then learning that fact, I switched to instant coffee. So now I work with instant coffee when I'm painting, to sort of reference the disparities that exist when we're thinking about food, and like who gets access to what. And then I started bringing iron into my practice as I was thinking about iron being this material that sort of falls apart over time. Like if you use iron on cloth and you wash it, it's going to start sort of tearing away. And I like the idea of that being a metaphor for memory as well and time. So I'm also very explicit about where and like what parts I'm using iron with. So that plane up there is a pesticide plane that they use to spray crops with. And I use iron in that one because I would love it to start falling apart over time. Same thing with the print back there. It's coffee and iron. And the text says, La idea siempre fue regresar. The idea was to always return. And it's an image of the mountains in Medellin, and just thinking about how when my parents returned to Colombia, what they knew and understood or remembered was going to be different than what existed when they got back. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I was wondering about, I really like fascinated by this idea of like materials and organic materials as part of like an archive as well. But it also, I also love how you work with like decay, and I feel like there's a tension between like decay and like the archival and also like preserve too. And I was wondering if that's like how you work in that tension, or that's something you feel like that's like.
Yeah, I think I'm really inserting my opinion when I'm using iron, and I'm like, this, we don't need this, and that's like me being like stubborn. But then there's also this idea, like the calling card is made of paper normally, right? And it's something that like will deteriorate over time, does not last. And by making it ceramic, I'm saying like this is something that should be preserved. So that's sort of the way that I think about it. Yeah, if that helps. I think about arches as like a portal or like a doorway. Um, so I think I'm also referencing sort of this like in betweenness of time. It's also why I really like using chiffon, because when I'm thinking of like a memory, it's almost like it's there but it's not, you can like travel to it, but maybe you can't touch it. So I think the archway feels like a portal of time as well. And the color is like aesthetic. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So I obviously pull a lot from family. And I'm also really explicit about whose faces I show and whose faces I sort of cover, but like still show. So the portrait back there, it's called Tío Jaime, Portrait of a Banana Farmer. And that's my uncle, my Tío Jaime. And he was a banana farmer. He worked in Colombia for Dole and worked in the field with the bananas and ended up getting stomach cancer from the pesticides that they were spraying, and he passed away. So for me, his story has been really important in my trajectory as an artist. A lot of the early prints that I was making were about specifically bananas and food justice. And it's been like that story that has inspired that conversation in my work. And it was really important for me, even though he's not with us anymore and like can't consent to his face being shown or not, to make sure that people did know what he looked like as sort of a way to remember him. And it's very important, I think, for me also in this show in particular, sort of bringing in the conversation of el campo, or like the countryside, because these are stories that don't really get to be told. As I was conceptualizing the show, I learned that, so there was the war on drugs in Colombia and like through Latin America, and there were a lot of landmines left in Colombia after the war on drugs had ended. And they're like just below ground level, and they're all in the countryside, and they're still like detonating like after many, many years. And that's like an act of violence that continues that people are not talking about. And the government is doing this thing where they remove a layer of dirt to remove the landmines, and soil holds memory and history. So also thinking about, yeah, bringing that conversation of el campo in, because it's just like this quiet thing that's happening in the countryside that's like really violent, and we're removing this layer of dirt, but also the act of removing that layer is also like an act of removing history, or like erasing a history. So reconciling with that as well. Yeah. And then these people are my parents when they were young and in love. They're still in love with each other. Maybe not young anymore, even though my dad has a very young soul. And for me, they are undocumented. So for me, it was really important to make sure that their faces, it's like sort of an act of protection on my end, even though my mom, as I was painting this and like embroidered over their faces, she was like, send it to me, like send me a picture of it without the embroidery. And I was like, I can't do that because it doesn't exist in that way. But yeah, that feels protective. And that's sort of like the way that I decide whose face appears in my work and whose doesn't. Yeah.
Through your constant research for this exhibition and within your own practice, how has the idea of home shifted and changed for you, and how do you define home?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think I often talk about Colombia and the United States and sort of like the relationship between these two countries that I call home. But I'm also someone who doesn't really believe in borders. And I think that, so like when I'm calling Colombia, Colombia, I also recognize that that's a way of like stating these like countries' lines. And for me, as someone who's like moved around a lot and has family in a lot of different places, home has, and like through my research and just like figuring out like what I feel connected to and what I don't feel connected to. I used to say that like home was in the people around me, and like that I find home in people. But I think over time I have felt that like you define what home is for you, and I feel that it's in myself and I carry it with me. Yeah. Thanks for that question. Yeah.
Does anyone else have? Oh yeah.
I'm very interested in what
Yeah, so these are my mosquito net pieces. They're part of a series, and it is a way to sort of bring the conversation of the countryside again into the space. I love the mosquito net as sort of like a way to have a conversation around protection, right? Like there's these thin veils that sort of go over your bed, but also are like within a home, and you're just like in your secret safe, or not secret, but like you're just in your little safe space, protected from like external elements, but you can still see everything that's around you. And yeah, the chains themselves, I think it's interesting, the like delicate nature of the fabric with like a weighted chain, and like the chains have like grenades in them, so think considering that as like a landmine. Landmines are not as beautiful as a grenade aesthetically, so I made that choice to maybe change that, but still sort of talking about violence, and the way that it's enacted onto the countryside. Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Thank you for bringing up the skill that you used to.
You what?
Thank you for bringing up the skill that you used to.
Yeah. Oh.
Okay, anything else? Beautiful. Thank you, Paola.
Thank you, everybody.